I discovered doing this research an unanticipated hazard that I'm sure most of you have discovered too, which is that studying the morally exceptional is really hard on your ego. You daily realize what more you could be doing. For example, Dorothy Day is morally exceptional. I mean, she's really exceptionally morally exceptional. I think we really need to distinguish amongst these types of people. I think morally exceptional people could sit around and talk about how they wish they were like Dorothy Day because she would be exceptional amongst them. She founded the Catholic Workers Movement. At about age 30, she converted to Catholicism and decided to, the only way that she could really do good for the poor and help them is by becoming one of them. So she voluntarily gave up all of her possessions and luxuries and founded this Catholic Workers Movement. She advocated for poor people during the Depression, people that might die without her help. She found food for them and shelter. She was an advocate. She was a leader in the women's suffrage movement, went to jail many times for protests about that. She was also a pacifist. She's really someone to model. She also represents sort of three serious difficulties with studying the morally exceptional as a topic. The first difficulty is the one I was just talking about. The problem that they are so good that they immediately make us feel bad about ourselves, and we tempted to therefore put them away. There's sort of three options we have. We can try to emulate them, right, and try to become better, to do like them. But there's two other options that seem a little more appealing that we usually do. One option is to derogate them, say that they're not really actually morally exceptional, find some flaws in their lives. All the morally exceptional people have done something not great. So find the thing that they didn't do that was great. See, they're not actually morally exceptional. Or say there's something psychologically wrong with them, or they're just doing it for their own ego. They're just doing it to show off or to be better than others. So we derogate them so that we don't have to we feel bad about not being like them. That's a second option. The third option that people often do is they sort of dismiss them as not relevant. And this happens with Dorothy Day, and she fought against it her whole life. People say, oh, she's not really one of us. She's a saint. She's different than us. We can't expect ourselves to be like her because she's got some sort of like superhero powers that makes her able to give up luxuries. We can't do that, and we shouldn't expect it of ourselves. And she fought about that daily. She wrote book after book about how, no, I'm not special. I am ordinary, and you should do exactly the same thing as me. I expect you to be in poverty just like me. And she wrote article after article about this. And she gave guidance on how to do that. She said, don't try to do it all in one day. Don't give up all your possessions today. She said, do it in small steps, you know. Have one less pizza this week, right? Maybe don't buy the new car this year. Wait till next year to buy your new car. And if you go step by step, you'll start to realize it's actually not that bad. You're actually just as happy as you were before. And maybe you've got some more fulfillment in the bargain, and so you feel better. And so she was urging people constantly. It doesn't work. People still dismiss her. She's not a saint, although there's a canonization process going on, because she doesn't want it, and her followers don't want it either, because that would be a way of making her irrelevant to us, which she didn't want and her followers don't want. So a second problem with studying the morally exceptional is that people don't agree on who's morally exceptional. So we get this problem constantly. I don't know if you encounter this too. It doesn't matter whether we're at a conference, whether we're talking to the media, whether we're talking to people in our personal lives. The first thing they say is, well, who's to decide who's morally exceptional? People don't agree. That's your definition of the morally exceptional. What about my definition? And this is a serious problem or barrier potentially to studying the morally exceptional. If no one agrees on who's morally exceptional, then we can't possibly be studying the morally exceptional. And Dorothy Day represents this because she kind of alienated the Catholic hierarchy originally. And they called her a communist, a radical, a revolutionary, just a complainer. And they really didn't like her. And so some people thought of her as morally exceptional, and other people thought of her as really a bad person. She really exemplified it really neatly in the Spanish Civil War. because she managed to alienate both the Catholic and the worker, right? Because she's a pacifist. Amongst her other things, she was a pacifist, and she said we should not fight in Spain, which really alienated the Catholics because they took the side of Franco and said we needed to defend Franco against the atheist communists. And she alienated the workers because the defenders of the Republic were the communists, and they said that you need to fight to defend them against fascists. And so both sides went against her. She lost her newspaper, dropped to like 0 circulation, but then she recovered because she's a superhero. Oops. The third problem she exemplifies, a third problem for studying the morally exceptional, is identifying them, finding them to study. The problem with Dorothy Day, for researchers' perspective, is that she's dead. We can't do experiments on her. I was thinking about Adam's talk, and I was like, it'd be really nice if we could present like 40 different temptations to Jesus and like see like which ones he was going to accept and which ones he wasn't, and maybe do it at different ages, do it when he's 12, do it when he's 30. We can't do that. Most of these people that we try to find to be more exceptional are either, in the public arena, they don't have time to be subjects in our studies, or we just can't find them, they're rare, or they're dead, so you can't do experiments on them. So that's a third problem with the morally exceptional. So what I'm going to talk about today is some research that we've done here, addressing some of those problems. The point of this whole project is the RFP. That was the majority of our funds. The majority of our effort was put into the RFP. And that's exemplified in the conference here. And we're real excited to see that, all the results of all that work. But we also did do some research here at Wake Forest during this time. And it occurred to us, I think it was one of our, was it you, Eric? Somebody said, people might actually be curious about the research you guys were doing here. So I thought, okay, well, maybe we'll take an hour to share some of that research that we're doing also with you. So what is the goal of the Beacon Project? There are multiple goals, but the main goal is to quicken the study of the morally exceptional. It's been going on for decades, but not at a real high level. And so we were hoping with this infusion of these people and these resources, really talented young people, doing this, that maybe this could become a more prominent field and really sort of take off. And that is the goal. Why do we study them? Well, one is they're fascinating on their own. They're just interesting people. Like Dorothy Day, you think about, like, how did she do that? Why did she do that? What was it like to alienate both the Catholics and the workers, your base, the people you like depend on when you're feeling down and small, and you like think, well, at least they like me. Now they hate you too. I mean, what's that like? Right? It's interesting to think about them. They reveal the moral capacities of humans more directly. When we look at Dorothy Day to see, like, what are we really capable of as human beings? Looking at the average person, does it really tell us what human beings are capable of? Like all of the most experiments are done on average people. It doesn't tell us what we're morally capable of. They make a big difference. A lot of people probably would have died without Dorothy Day. Civil rights movements are started. Civil rights are granted because of morally exceptional people. Atrocities are stopped. Lives are saved. Even, when someone donates an organ that saves a child's life, they really do make a difference. Their psychosocial systems may offer particularly clear insights into the factors that lead to moral behavior. And that's because you can study morality in average people, but there's so much other stuff going on, like, pizza, right? And so it's distracting. It's hard to see the morality part. And so with morally exceptional people, it's just more prominent, so you can see it more easily, you can study it better. And then finally, they're potentially guides for the rest of us. It can be a really good way to help people become more morals, to look at morally exceptional people. So this is a quick overview of the research that we did. You can see the questions. You don't need to read all this. The questions down the end that we've mostly focused on, like what are people who report very high scores on morality questionnaires like? What do people think about the morally exceptional? How do they perceive moral actions? How do the morally exceptional give in to these situational experiments that social psychologists do? How do the morally exceptional function? Do they identify with all humanity? Do they flourish? We also have developed new measures. It's not a question. I was going to change that. sorry. Are there new measures we can develop that will help us to understand the morally exceptional? And do they guide moral decisions? The three that are highlighted slightly in blue up there, okay, 1, 2, 3, are the ones I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to talk about the rest. Here over here is the number of studies that we did in each of those questions. So we've been busy too. Well, Ashley and some of the students have been busy. Meg. All right, so I'm just going to talk about those three because they correspond to those three problems in studying the morally exceptional, those three potential barriers, and the ones that are represented by Dorothy Day. So the first one is agreement and disagreement on the kind of people who are morally exceptional. So we wanted to find out, do people agree on who's morally exceptional, what kind of people are morally exceptional, to reveal the magnitude of this barrier. Like, how bad is it for the study of the morally exceptional? If people totally disagree on the morally exceptional, that's a serious barrier. It doesn't mean you can't study the morally exceptional, but it really makes a serious barrier. If people pretty much agree, then that barrier is really maybe not such a serious barrier. People expect that everybody disagrees. It's also, if we can find that maybe there's some things that people agree on and other things they don't agree on, then those things they agree on, that doesn't mean those are actually the characteristics of morally exceptional, obviously. But it does mean that those are good candidates to start with. Like to start by, let's take the ones everybody agrees on. Maybe those are the ones that are the characteristics of morally exceptional. We also are interested in this question of whether the ends towards which people direct their moral exceptionality are separable from the psychological processes that they use to do that, the means. So let me give you an example to illustrate this. So suppose you've got somebody who's an abortion rights activist and abortion rights, an activist against abortion rights, okay? So you have these two people, one in favor of abortion rights, one against it. And they're both activists. People who are in favor of abortion rights are going to see this person, and they're not only activists, they're very prominent, they're very effective, right? So people who are in favor of abortion rights are going to see the person in favor of abortion rights as morally exceptional. And they're going to see the person who's against abortion rights as morally bad. Not only not exceptional, but actually bad morally. And conversely, the people who are against abortion rights are going to see the person who's in favor of abortion rights as morally bad, and their own person as morally exceptional. So they're going to disagree fundamentally on who's morally exceptional. The question is, what about the psychological processes? Does the fact that you're in favor of abortion rights mean that your activism is caused by different psychological processes than if you're against abortion rights? Right? Then they have different different psychological processes that led to that. Or is it the same psychological processes behind both being against and for abortion rights, but it's just for different ends based on other factors about what you value and so forth? So it'd be interesting to see if you can separate those out. And then finally, it's big right now. It's always big, but it seems like we have really big divides about who our heroes are in our society. It's a really important issue going on right now, and it'd be interesting to see, like, do we agree or disagree? So the way we do this study is we get people to pick 3 targets, 3 people that they know that fit into these categories. They nominate someone who's morally exceptional, and you don't need to read all this. But the description that the instructions we tell people are: pick someone you have known or who you consider to be extremely moral. Pick the 3 most moral people you know or have ever known. So it's someone they know, and it's the most moral that they think. And then of those 3, pick the most moral person. So this should be the most moral person they think they've ever known in their minds. Then for morally average, pick 3 people you consider to be morally average. They should be the 3 most average people. And then pick the most average of those. So supposedly this will end up with the most average person. And then finally, for the morally bad, we said, okay, pick 3 people you consider to be immoral. Ideally, these are the 3 least moral people you know. And then the most immoral of those 3, okay? So they're very similar, very analogous, but just differing in what part of the moral scale. So they did that. They picked 3 people, each perceiver picked 3 targets, and then they rated those targets on some characteristics. So for example, reflective moral awareness is things like he or she thinks about the morality of his or her actions almost every day. Okay, so that's the way the reflective moral awareness construct is measured. And so perceiver 1 rated his or her 3 targets. These are different people, right? So if I was perceiver 1, I might have picked, my former pastor is the most moral person I've ever known. A colleague is the most morally average person I know. And this bully in elementary school is like the most immoral person I ever knew. Eric might pick, June as the most moral person he's ever known. One of his colleagues is one of the most average people, and his former postdoc advisor is the most immoral person. He has 2 former postdoc advisors. And then a third person might pick, their kindergarten teacher as their most moral person they ever knew. A friend of theirs is the most average person, and maybe a person who owns the hardware store down the street is the most immoral person they've ever known. So they're totally different people. And they rate them on how much they think about reflective or moral awareness. And we're interested in, do they make distinctions amongst these targets on that characteristic? And do they agree on what those distinctions are? So for example, this first perceiver might say, oh yeah, the morally exceptional person I pick is a 7, the average is a 5, and the morally bad person is not reflective, doesn't have reflective moral awareness at all, doesn't think about these things. And the second person might say, well, 6 for the exceptional person, 4 for the average person, 2 for the worst person, 5, and then the third person might say 5, 3, and 3. And you can see these people agree with each other. Not perfectly, right? But there's a good amount of agreement. They make distinctions on how reflective they are about their moral awareness, and they agree on what those distinctions are between the exceptional and the average and the immoral. Here's an example where we see disagreement. They make distinctions, but they make different distinctions. So the perceiver 1 sees the person in the middle as the one who's least reflective, and the extremely bad and extremely good is very reflective. The second person says, no, the average person is the one who's most reflective. And then the third person says, no, it's the immoral person who's the most reflective. Moral people, the moral person I have just doesn't reflect at all. They're just moral, right? So they make different distinctions. So that would be disagreement. Here, there might be systematic disagreement. So it might be that one group of people, say people, I just picked red for some reason. People from red states, for example, might say that no, people that are morally exceptional are very reflective. People that are average are sort of somewhat reflective, and people that are bad are not reflective at all. While people from blue states may say the opposite. No, people that are immoral are very reflective, and people that are moral are not reflective at all. And so there you have disagreement, but you have systematic disagreement. So we're going to look at that too. So the first question was, well, how much agreement is there? Is there any? Is there any distinctions, and do people agree with them? And the answer is, oh my God, there's a huge agreement. This perceived barrier that people don't agree is totally not there. So 0% agreement is when people just make different distinctions. So anything greater than 0 means that they're making the same distinctions. 60%, 60 to 70% means they're almost making identical distinctions. That example I showed you of agreement would not have been 70%. That would have been much lower than that. So they're making distinctions, and they're making the same distinctions. That's especially true for guilt proneness, reflective moral attentiveness, moral identity, behaviors that they enact, self-control, utilitarianism. Religiosity, there's still quite a bit of agreement, 30% agreement that morally exceptional people are more religious than bad people, but it's not as much. And then there's almost no agreement. There's just a tiny bit, about 5 or 10% of agreement on perceptual moral attentiveness. We replicated this with another sample to make sure, same exact pattern. We also did the nominations differently, where instead of having them pick people they know, we had them pick public figures, so people they didn't know. And here we get the same pattern. So even with public figures. So I want to just remind you of the potential for disagreement here. It could be, the one reason there would be disagreement is these are totally different people. My 3 people that I nominate are totally different than the next perceiver's nominations. Yet we're agreeing that the people we pick, even though they're totally different, are different on empathy, and they differ in the same way. Secondly, we might differ on what kinds of people we think are morally exceptional. It's the second source of disagreement. But no, we pick the same kinds of people. So there's multiple sources of potential disagreement, yet people are agreeing. All right, so put all these numbers up here for fun. Make them small. We use 3 digits to like really make it intimidating. We only needed like 1, but you know. So don't bother with this table. I want you to notice, the only thing I want you to notice about this table is like most is not significant, okay? There's just, and most numbers are pretty small. I'll come to that, back to that, what that means, and I'll walk through that. But this is systematic disagreement. What we're looking at here is, are there characteristics of people that make them make different distinctions? And we picked the juiciest characteristics of people. We said these are the ones that are going to make the most difference. We picked, political values and moral values. That should be, if anything's going to make a difference, that should be it. We picked those and we said, do they make a difference in the distinctions people make between morally exceptional and morally bad? And the answer is not really. A little bit, not much. So even people that are liberal versus conservative kind of say the same people pretty much agree on who's morally exceptional. Now there's exceptions to that. I'll step through them. So let me just give you an example of what these numbers mean. So you see this self-control negative 0.056. That's significant. So it's connected to religiosity of the perceiver and self-control of the targets. It's negative. So what this is this is the effect of the perceiver characteristic on the distinction between the morally exceptional and the morally bad, the average and the morally bad. So a negative 0.056 means that people that are more religious make less distinction, because it's negative, between morally exceptional and morally bad people on self-control. People that are less religious make more of a distinction on self-control. But it's negative 0.056 is barely a distinction. Okay? The next one is religiosity. That's positive 0.22. So that says, that's positive. So that says people that are more religious make more distinction, because it's positive, between the morally exceptional and the morally average and the morally poor on how religious they are. So that's more important to them. They make more distinctions than people who aren't religious. That kind of makes sense. But again, it's 0.22. There's a slightly more distinction, but it's not huge. Everybody's still basically agreeing morally exceptional people are more religious than morally bad people. But it's even more true for people that are religious. And then behavior is 0. Doesn't matter how religious you are, you make the same distinction between morally exceptional and morally bad on how much they act morally. Okay, let me just show you what this means. This is another very small difference that was significant. So what we have is how much the distinction there is on self-control between morally exceptional and immoral people, an average. And what you see is that there's a huge amount of perceived distinction. People see morally exceptional people as having much more self-control than those who are immoral. Now, here, the blue bar is people who are low on social dominance orientation, and the tan bar is people who are high on social dominance orientation. Social dominance orientation is one of the pillars of conservatism. So you can say you can sort of substitute, if you know what that is, and then you can use that interpretation. If you don't, you can just substitute conservatism in here for simplicity's sake. And so what you're seeing is that people that are more liberal make slightly more distinction on self-control between the morally exceptional and the immoral, and people that are conservative make slightly less distinction. But basically the pattern is here, there's a huge distinction. Everybody agrees. Morally exceptional people have more self-control than those who are immoral. Okay. So we do find the differences that happen are that political conservatives and the religious perceive moral exemplars as more religious. You can see those are positive, 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 and then this is political orientation, right-wing authoritarianism, and religiosity. They see religiosity as more important, and the progressives see religiosity as less important in distinguishing. Here's an example of that. This is how religious they are, the distinctions in religion between the morally exceptional and the immoral, and you see that both progressives and non-progressives see the morally exceptional as more religious than the immoral, but for the low progressives, the conservatives, it's more of a distinction. You also see that that's the political attitudes and values are the primary sources of disagreements. Most of the significant results related to right-wing authoritarianism, social dominance orientation, religiosity, and progressivism. Here is one of the bigger differences, where it shows up in the values. And this is representative of how values are looking often. So what you see here is that what is the difference between the valuing of authority between morally exceptional and immoral people? Well, for politically conservative people, there's a big difference. Morally exceptional people value authority as a moral foundation, while immoral people don't. For the liberals, they don't make any distinction. They don't think morally exceptional people are any more or any less likely to value authority. So now when you talk about the values, there starts to be some pretty big differences. This is the sources of disagreement about public figures. The only thing you need to get out of this is there's a lot more asterisks, and the numbers are slightly bigger. So there's more disagreement when it comes to political figures, but it's the same pattern. It's about the values that they're disagreeing. They're not disagreeing about the psychological processes. So you can see here, it's politically, the differences are in the values. And I'm going to go ahead and show you an example of one of those. It's a crossover, okay? And so this is like the abortion rights example. So here we've got the authority value. This is the same figure I just showed you about authority value, except that was rating people you know. This is rating public figures. And here you can see the conservatives still see morally exceptional people as valuing authority more than immoral people. The liberals see exactly the opposite. They think morally exceptional people devalue authority, and the immoral people are the ones who value authority. Okay. So when it comes to the values, there's quite a bit of difference. And it's public figures and values. So what do we conclude about that? What we conclude is that there's high agreement about what kinds of people are morally exceptional, who the moral exemplars are. Most disagreement is about the ends, and that disagreement can be large. The ends that their moral exceptionality is directed towards. That's where people disagree on who's morally exceptional about. But there's very little disagreement about the psychological processes. Everybody pretty much agrees that the people that are morally exceptional have self-control, they have a high moral identity, they are empathetic, they're prone to guilt, they're prone to feel guilt, and they reflect about moral issues on a daily basis. Everybody agrees. So I might pick Dorothy Day as my morally exceptional person. You might pick Billy Graham as your morally exceptional person. And we might say, oh, no, let's just say, suppose for sake, that I'm very liberal and the other person's very conservative. They might disagree completely, like, oh, no, your person's morally bad. Dorothy Day's morally bad. And I might say, no, Billy Graham's morally bad. But then if we look at what do you think Billy Graham's like? Oh, well, he's got lots of self-control. Morality is really important to his identity. He's very empathetic. He thinks about morality daily. And I might say, oh yeah, Dorothy Day's just the same way. She has lots of self-control. She's very empathetic. She thinks about morality daily. So we might have the same kind of person. It's just that they're going in different directions, and so therefore we pick different people. Okay, so we don't think disagreement is a major barrier, although it's an interesting barrier. All right, how do we find the morally exceptional? Second problem, and here's the successive selection method. What we start with is a big undifferentiated mass of people. Psychologists always make these tilted ovals. I don't know if you're familiar with that. That's people. And what we want is, we want this group up here, the really super moral people, right? That's who we want to study, this tiny group of people that are super moral. And we want to contrast them with someone, potentially, perhaps, the really morally bad people. We might have a small number of them, too. We want to get there. So how do we do that? That's pretty hard. That's a real serious barrier, because we got to do that if we're going to study the morally exceptional. We got to find those people. But it's hard to do. I mean, some past methods that people have done have included like self-report. And, of course, self-report can have problems. Many of us in the Beacon Project are quite fans of self-report, but self-report definitely has problems, and that you might get people who aren't actually morally exceptional, who say that they are. Another solution is to pick people who won awards for being caring Canadians or heroes. And that's a great way to go, too. However, this problem there is that there's a limited number of these people who have won awards, and it's a result of a political process. And as we saw yesterday, social prominence does not necessarily connect to being actually moral. So that's a great way to go, but we don't want that to be the only way. Another way is to pick morally great historical figures. Another great way to go. Problem is, can't do experiments on them. Can't get them to fill out questionnaires, and there's only a small number of them. Another way is to pick people who've been morally exceptional in particular domains, rescued Jews in the Holocaust, or are vegans, or have given organs away. And that's great too, limited number of those, their moralities in a particular domain. So these are all good methods to go, but they have problems. We'd like to have some other method, like a test. When we study the cognitively exceptional, there's like a test you can give. We'd like to have a test that we could give to find out if people are morally exceptional. And that's problematic. It'd be great if we could do that, but what kind of test are we going to do? Well, we want a test that identifies morally exceptional people. That would be the first thing. We want a test that actually identifies morally exceptional people. We want a test that uses actual behavior, that actually uses moral behavior and puts them to test and see if they're moral. And we want a test that's like efficient. So we could, one idea is we could just give them a whole bunch of moral situations, like put them in 20 moral situations and see if they like pass them or not. But that would probably take like weeks or months to do that, because you have to set up this moral situation, and it's very complicated, and you have to have all these confederates come in, and you have to get really good actors who are able to say like, oh, you sure? That's like 3,000 euros. I don't know if I can do that or not. So yeah, it's really hard to set up these tests, just one of them. And so how are you going to set up 30 of them? Because ideally you want to have multiple behaviors. So this is where we came up with this successive selection method. So the idea is that we start with the undifferentiated mass. We test everybody on the first test. And then the people who pass that test get to go to the second test. Everybody else is out. Then the people who pass that second test get to go to the third test. And then everybody who passes that one gets to go on. Everybody who fails that one is out. Right? And so we keep going on that with successive tests until we're left with just a small group of people that have passed a series of tests. It's still pretty expensive and costly because you had to do these things, but you do fewer subjects on each one. So it's a nice kind of compromise and balance between actually using behavior and efficiency of measurement. So this is what we did. We first got an undifferentiated mass of people and asked them to be honest in a tough situation. We gave them these books and said, we want to see how smart you are. How many of these books have you read? And the person who's read the most is going to win some money. And so, you look at that and you're like, Westgate story, yeah, I think I read that, right? Westgate story, yeah, I read that. And you're like, Two Cliffs Apart, I got to have read that. So some of these are real. I read Catcher in the Rye, I'm pretty sure. I don't think I read Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. No. So people who say they've read a lot of these books are lying, right? And then we also asked them, which of these are people that are commonly studied among smart people in college. How many of them did you study? And you're like, oh, Brunert, he was the guy. I studied him. And so the people who mentioned more people here are lying. And then finally, we gave them some tough logic problems to see if they could solve those. Like, in a computer language, 10 A's in a row can be deleted. The word ABAB can be deleted. And the word BBB can be replaced with AAAB. For example, blah, 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 blah. Using these rules, what is equivalent to ABBAA? Well, that's impossible. You can't. You can't answer that question based on that information. But some people give answers. And we actually gave them the answer key. We said, now tell us how many you got right. After you're done, look at the answer key, see how many you got right. And the person who got the most right is going to be eligible to win a prize. And so people who said that they got a certain number right were lying, okay? So we started with this undifferentiated mass, and then we took the people who didn't lie on any of those, right? And those who lied on at least one of them. And we got down to 41 and 59 people in each of the two groups, potentially morally exceptional and potentially morally bad. Second test was avoid hypocrisy and selfishness. So they came to the lab, sat down. Experimenter came in and said, told them that there's another subject in this other room. You will never see them. You don't know who they are. And there's this really bad task one of you is going to have to do. It's really going to be unpleasant. And there's this other really great task that one of you is going to have to do. And lucky you get to choose who gives what task. And you're like, well, I should give the good task to the other person, but wait a minute, then I get the bad task. Alternatively, I could give the bad task to the other person, then I get the happy good task in which you might have a chance of winning money. And so then the experimenter says, most people feel like flipping a coin is the fairest way to do this, so you should probably flip a coin. And people are like, oh yeah, okay, I'll flip a coin. And then when they do that, it turns out, the experimenter leaves, they flip a coin, and 90% of the people end up giving the bad task to the other person. That's been shown as many times. And so what we did is we said, well, people who take the bad task for themselves are past this test and move on to the potentially morally exceptional. And people who gave the bad task to the other person and also lied on the previous task go into the morally indifferent. So we got down to this group, and then this step got us down to 13 and 22 subjects. The next round we brought it in. Subject came in, experimenter came in and said, there's another subject in another room. And then there was an envelope on the table. That envelope had, the experimenter left. The envelope had $5 in quarters in it. And the subject could keep as many of those quarters as they want and put as many in the envelope for the other subject as they wanted to. And we said, as long as you kept no more than a third of the money, you would go to the morally exceptional group, potentially morally exceptional. And if you kept more than that, you were not allowed, you would go into the morally indifferent group. And when we did that, we went through the steps, and we ended up with 8 people in the morally exceptional group and 6 in the morally indifferent. So we successfully winnowed people down. And then what we did to find out, well, does this work at all? This is just a proof of concept, right? We gave them a bunch of self-report questionnaires to see if they're different. It turns out they're quite different from each other, those two groups. We have N of 14. There's low power in terms of numbers, and so only the first half is significant. The second half is not significant. It's all in the right direction, but it's not significant. But you can see people that pass those tests believe in human rights more, identify with their community more, identify with America more, are more honest and humble, they believe in human rights more, they have more guilt proneness, they're more loyal, and they're more humble on self-report questionnaires. Okay? So what does that tell? But the point of this is tricky, the point of this is the cross-validation. We don't know if either one of those methods is right, but they agree with each other. And that suggests that maybe they're both right. They could agree with each other for false reasons, but it's pretty hard to make that happen. So the fact that they agree with each other sort of gives supporting evidence to both of them as being valid because of that cross-validation. So it tells us that the self-reports of morality have some validity because they predicted what these people did in actual situations, in multiple actual situations. The successive situation method has some validity as a way to pick morally exceptional people because the ones who passed all those tests ended up having really high scores on the self-report tests. And the ones who failed all those tests had low scores on the self-report tests. So it provides validation to the method of selecting morally exceptional people. So that's as far as we've gotten with that. But we think that this is potentially a really good way to identify morally exceptional people. That's a test that's based on behavior that is efficient, at least somewhat, for actually running. All right, last problem is, do people actually follow the morally exceptional? Or do they push them aside and ignore them? We have a theory called the PARAGON theory. And according to this theory, that when people make moral decisions, they consider a broader range of factors than moral values for figuring out what the right thing to do is, right? They should know the word right means you're only supposed to consider moral, right? But actually, when they're considering what the right thing to do is, they consider a broader range of values than just moral, ethical ones. And these broader range of values, they're complicated to consider all these broader range of values, but the way they do it is by answering a question, well, what would a really good person do? That's how they make a moral decision. And that there are these images, further, I'm going through this theory really quickly. You can see it's very related to Linda Zagrebski's theory. So these ideas, these images of what a good person is, are represented as paragons that are cultural figures that are out there in the world that the culture has created of like how to be a good person. And that what you do when you're trying to make a moral decision is you consider what those good people would do, and then you follow that decision. You don't try to choose what's the morally correct thing to do. You figure out what does a good person do, and in particular, what is this good person that I think is a good person? All right, so the idea is here that not only do people not shy away from paragons because of the threat to their ego, but paragons are built into their basic life decisions and moral decisions, that they're fundamentally based on moral paragons. So the idea is that there's a two-step process. There are sort of these pre-paragon types, and then cultures create specific examples of them. So, for example, the good Joe is represented by Tom Hanks, the top dog is represented by Beyonce, and the brilliant eccentric is represented by Einstein. And then what people do is they pick which one sort of really is their representation of the good person. So what we do is we ask people to rate a whole bunch of these famous public figures, and they say, I identify with so-and-so. I would be satisfied if my life turned out like so-and-so. I would be offended if someone told me I was so-and-so. That's reversed. So-and-so is a good role model. I think so-and-so does the right thing. I would like to be like Beyonce. More people should try to be like Beyonce. And if you rate a person high on all those, you end up having that person as your moral paragon. And so you can see there are differences of opinion. Most people rate Mother Teresa high on those, but not everybody, right? Some people don't rate Mother Teresa that high on those. They don't think everybody should be like Mother Teresa. Most people don't think people should try to be like Lindsay Lohan, but a few do. A few people are like, yeah, the world would be better if more people were like Lindsay Lohan. Right? And so that person thinks Lindsay Lohan is the model of how to be a good person. So here's some examples of people and some of the ratings. The important thing is the standard deviation. People disagree with each other about who is moral paragon. They have different paragons. And so what we do in these experiments is people come in the room, they rate all of these various people, and one of these people emerges as their highest rated person. This person picked Jane Goodall. And so then they go to the next stage where they're told a moral dilemma. We took from the ethicist, I think the New York Times ethicist, and took some real examples in there. This is a real example where this woman went to the nursing home, had a good time with her dad who has Alzheimer's, and as she was leaving, he started crying because he was going to miss her. And so she couldn't get out the door, and so she just said, okay, look, I'm going to come tomorrow. She's like, I got to come back to my dad. I promise I come tomorrow. And he said, okay, you can go. And so she went, and then she got wrapped up in her day, she got busy, and she forgot that she had said she was going to come tomorrow. She didn't come until next week. And she got to the nursing home, and she said to the staff, like, oh, I didn't come the next day. Was my dad okay? And they're like, he forgot within 2 minutes that you were coming back. It was no problem at all, okay? So then she's like, she has her visit, and she's about to leave, and he starts crying again. And she's like, should I tell him that I'm coming back tomorrow, even though she has no intention of coming back tomorrow? Okay, it's a good example for you, Christian. And so this is this moral dilemma. And people were given the choice of getting some information about what their personal paragon, and this person was being told, you could find out what Jane Goodall did in this situation, or you could find out what moral principles tell you is the right thing to do in this situation. Okay? And then after they were done that, they received endorsement, whichever one they chose, and then they rated what's the morally correct thing to do. So first off, most people picked moral principles. Right? So most people picked, this is a percentage of people choosing the Paragon guidance, and you can see most people never picked the Paragon guidance. They wanted to know moral principles. About a third of the time they picked the Paragon. So that was a surprise to us. But what's interesting is so when they got the moral principles, it made a difference. We randomly said the principle said you should lie, or the principle said you should not lie. And people followed what the moral principles told them to do. They followed the endorsed action they rated the endorsed action as more moral than the unendorsed action. So they listened to the moral principles. But when they were told simply that their Paragon endorsed one action, nothing else, no reasons, versus the other action, it made a huge difference. So knowing that Jane Goodall lied to her dad makes it much more moral than knowing that Jane Goodall did not lie to her dad. Makes it much less moral. While knowing the moral principle doesn't make much difference. Okay? So this was only true on some of our dilemmas. Some of our dilemmas we found were like too easy. Everybody kind of just gave the same action, and this didn't work. So we thought, well, maybe we're just cherry picking. So we replicated those same exact dilemmas again, and got the same result. Okay, so we're confident that this is a real finding, that people prefer. They don't answer the question, what's the morally right thing to do? They answer the question, what would a good person do? And specifically, what would this particular person that I think is a good person do? Second time, we gave them a test of their utilitarianism versus deontology. So some of the people got results of whether they were told whether they're utilitarian or deontological based on the results of a test. So it was actually an accurate result. And other people got their paragon that they were chosen. And then they received endorsement from one of those two things, which was randomly assigned. We randomly assigned when we got the endorsement from in this case. And then they rated the actions. And then they also got no endorsement. A second set of dilemmas where there was no endorsement whatsoever. Okay? So I'll go through this. So the first thing we did was we looked, okay, some people got an endorsement from principles, that's the blue bar. The same principle that they had tested out for, right? Am I saying that right, Dylan? Yeah. And then and they followed that principle. And some people got the endorsement or endorsement of a given action from the paragon and went along with whatever action the paragon endorsed. And it was a huge difference. It was just a replication of the previous findings. But the next table shows you what happens with the next set of dilemmas where we didn't give them any endorsement at all. We just said, here's some more dilemmas. What do you think is the right thing to do? And we found that the principle that they had been told that in the first set of dilemmas had no carryover effect. It didn't make any difference to what they endorsed here. They did not endorse consistently with that. But the paragon had a huge carryover. Even though we stopped giving them endorsement by the paragon, they had learned what their paragon thinks is right or wrong and then applied that to a new set of dilemmas we had given no endorsement to. So they learned what their paragon thought is a good person and then continued to use that for new moral dilemmas in life. We had one more experiment where we tried to do like a process dissociation, sort of a quasi-process dissociation test. We said, is it because the paragons are saying this is the morally correct thing? Or is it just really because they're saying good people do this and it's a broader set of values than just the moral ethical dilemmas? So we had one condition where the paragon that they chose said both things. Lying to your father is moral and it's the best thing to do. And then we had the other condition where they said lying to your father may not be the morally best thing to do, but it's still the best thing to do. Which doesn't really make logical sense in some sense, right? But that's what we said, people. And so then we looked at, well, is there a difference in the effect of this endorsement? So first we looked at the ratings for best and moral. And you saw that you see the same pattern. The endorsed action was rated as more moral, as a better action than the unendorsed action when the paragon said it was best and moral. These next ones show you what happens when it was best action but not moral. And what you see is you get the same pattern. The fact that it went from moral to not moral didn't make any difference to people. The only thing they care about is that the paragon says it's the best thing to do. Okay, and then again, that is with going with our argument that we think that people are not interpreting moral issues as issues about moral principles. They're interpreting moral issues as what do good people do, and I want to do what good people do. All right, so conclusion for that is that people make moral decisions on the basis of what a good person would do, and good people are defined by individually chosen paragons. Rather than shy away from the morally exceptional, people's basic moral decision processes are fundamentally based on the morally exceptional. They're basic decisions about life. So overall conclusion, agreement about what kinds of people are morally exemplars is high. There's this barrier that people don't agree with each other is really not a strong barrier. The disagreement that is there, that we are aware of, it has to do with the ends towards which that moral exceptional behavior is directed. But the processes, the psychological processes that constitute moral exceptionality do not have that disagreement. Second conclusion, people who resist a gauntlet of morally ambiguous actions are morally exceptional. Using these situations to identify people and self-reports cross-validates each other. They support each other and provide that extra validity that both of them might be identifying correctly the morally exceptional people. And then third, people make moral decisions on the basis of what a good person would do, which is defined by these individually chosen paragons rather than on the basis of moral principles. So these three barriers that I talked about to study morally exceptional maybe aren't as bad. We can identify them, people do care about them and use them in their daily life, and people do agree on who they are. Thank you. In my defense, In my defense, we started a few minutes late because of the, but I'm sorry that took a little bit longer. But I do have 5 minutes for questions, and I hope that like maybe at lunch the philosophers can lay into me with all the problems that we did, and not to the rest of the team who don't don't deserve the attack. Yeah, right. Adam.
Will, thanks. This is really interesting. I had a question for you about the Paragon study.
Sure.
What do you make of the fact, I think I'm remembering correctly, it was about 30% who wanted to know what the Paragon did versus about 70% who wanted to know the moral principles.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, I'm sort of not surprised that the people who wanted to know what the Paragon did ended up making their judgments based on the Paragon.
Yeah.
But what do you make of the fact that so many people wanted to know the moral principles, but then seemed to not be very significantly influenced?
And by the way, that's why in the later studies we assign people which information they got.
Oh, okay.
So that there wasn't just the one, so both types of people got information from paragons and from moral principles, and so that it wasn't just that they picked that, but yeah. So yeah, I make 2 things out of that. One is that's counter to what we predicted. I expected that they would all choose the paragon because that's kind of the theory. So the first thing we make of that is like, okay, there's a slight wrong problem for the theory right there. Got to figure that out. We could ask you to help us. No? Okay, later. Secondly, the second thing is that it's interesting. So there's a recognition amongst people that when you make moral decisions, you're supposed to use moral principles. So they recognize that it's not like people are just like, oblivious or something. They recognize you're supposed to use moral principles. It's not what they end up doing. So that's the second thing that we make of that. We have to work that out still. Yeah. All right, I'm gonna go over here, Jeff.
Thanks, Will. That was fascinating. So I guess my question is about the agreement data. So you show that there's plenty of agreement at the level of very general psychological processes, but it seems like there could still be lots of disagreement about more specific psychological processes. So some people think empathy for non-human animals is what really matters. Other people disagree. Some people think self-control for this sort of temptation is what matters.
Yep.
Other people disagree.
Yeah, good.
So I guess my question is just, why is it that you think disagreement at the level of those very general processes is enough to disable this concern about disagreement about who is a moral exemplar?
Yeah. So first of all, I agree with you completely. And not only that, we just did 6 characteristics. We're just in the proof of concept stage. So we found some agreement that's pretty high. We have way too many studies planned for the future on this. And Dylan doesn't realize this, but he's going to be locked to our office and not get to go to graduate school in Texas. Sorry to inform you of that. So you can do all these experiments. But yeah, we completely agree there should be a lot more detail of the study. So why do we think that's enough to say that there's agreement?
Well, not enough to say that there's agreement, but why is that kind of agreement sufficient to disable a worry about,
Yeah. I think so. I would say that any agreement at all that's high, that's strong, is enough to disable the worry. Because now we know there's something that people agree on. So we know we can study those things. They might be the core. They might disappear, but we got to start in place now. It's like a beachhead, right? And maybe there's more, then maybe there's only those. We don't know what's going to happen in the future, but we got something to start with. And so the barrier is not 100%. We've reduced the barrier to an important degree. It's maybe quantitatively small, but it's qualitatively big because we've shown there's something that there's huge agreement on. Is that convincing to you? Okay, Erica.
Great talk. I was thinking about I really liked the task where you have multiple behaviors to kind of weed people out of who's actually an exemplar or not. But I was thinking about in terms of like item response theory, is that a type of scale that's going to be able to differentiate people who are, say, mid to high level? So you made extreme groups, low and high, but can you differentiate people who are mid-level moral from the high on that same kind of task? And do you have evidence that there is a difference?
Yeah, we don't. We didn't do that, and that would be hard, as you tried to do, and it's hard to do that, and we've had lots of theoretical discussions. It would be interesting to talk with you all about too at some point during this conference about what's the right comparison group for the morally exceptional. some people don't even have a comparison group at all. In some ways, you don't need a comparison group. You just want to find out what these people are like. And most of the study of the morally exceptional sort of just started with, like, what are Holocaust rescuers like? Right? Schindler's List didn't have, like, 2 parts to the movie, right? Here's the Holocaust rescuer, and here's some guy who didn't rescue any Jews, right? Because you need to know that, because you can't understand anything in that first part of that movie unless you have the second part, right? I mean, you don't necessarily need a comparison group at all, but for science, you pretty much do, right? And so then what's the right comparison group? Is it people all the way down at the other end? Well, maybe not, because then there might be something special about those people, and everything you're finding out is really just about morally bad people, and has nothing to do with morally exceptional people. So maybe average people is the right group, or maybe somewhere in between the average and the morally bad. It's not clear, and I would love to have further discussions about that.
I have a quick follow-up to that. So usually these self-reports are skewed in the positive direction. Like most people say they're really moral, and it's actually the tails that are standing on the but not moral. So I think that's why I'm asking the question of, like, when you are kind of tapping just the high end of the scale, everyone's kind of high. So that's why.
Yeah. Well, we only got like 6 out of 100 people who actually made it all the way through, or was it 8? I can't remember which one was 6 and which one was 8. But so we only got less than 10% of people made it all the way through. But you're absolutely right. We did another study where we got 10,000 people on MTurk to fill out some questionnaires, because we were going to pick the top, like, 3%. Well, it turns out, like, the top scores were like 12% of the people. Yeah. So we have a little problem right now that we're going to fix this summer, hopefully, or try to fix this summer. But yeah, so right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a plug for Mike Prentice's talk later, because he's going to show some of these. I don't know if you're really going to get into that shake pattern, but he's got average, morally bad, and morally good people, and he's going to show the differences across the board there. I'm done. Sorry.